After being court-martialled from the army in 1799, George Montagu moved to Kingsbridge with his friend in science, Eliza Dorville, and devoted himself to natural history. He wrote, "The days of darkness are now past, when the researches of naturalists were considered as trivial and uninteresting. In the present age, it is acknowledged that every link in the great chain of nature is important." He was among the earliest members of the Linnaean Society, which is one of the world's leading organisations for the study of taxonomy and natural history. In 1802, he wrote his pioneering Ornithological Dictionary, the first accurate description of British birds. This was beautifully illustrated by Eliza. And contains minute details of the structure, life history and habits of British birds and his methods of study. His techniques involved shooting and stuffing birds, caging and manipulating. But he also had a soft side and wrote of the creatures he studied, "They also feel the impulse of love, the greatest dictate of nature." His study overlooked his large garden, where he built aviaries and a large pond, which became his duckery. Live birds all over the grounds, and ducks, gulls, and all sorts of swimming birds in the pond. It had broadleaf trees and conifers, in which a goldcrest nested. Montagu tells this story in his dictionary. "I took the nest when the young were 6 days old, placed it in a basket, and by degrees enticed the old ones to my study window, and then within the window, then at the opposite side of the room. The female would feed them, even when I held the nest in my hand. The male never ventured beyond the window frame." The visits of the female were 36 times an hour, 16 hours in a day. 8 out of 10 fledged. He kept many birds in aviaries to study their development, thereby finding that some species were invalid, as they were the same bird in summer or winter plumage, and that, conversely, varieties of the same species were in fact, quote, "perfectly distinct." The famous example of this was his discovery that the hen harrier were 2 species. An acquaintance, Mr. Tucker, had taken a nest with 3 young and raised them. 2 survived, 1 male and 1 female. By observing the developing plumage, he confirmed a new species, now known as Montagu's harrier. He kept several ruff and showed that the then Greenwich sandpiper was a ruff in winter plumage. There had been confusion over males and females of the same species. An example was the white-throated duck, which he realised was a female scaup duck. He was the first to identify the cirl bunting in Britain at Tacket Wood, and couldn't resist taking some home to rear. In 1806 he received a live scaup duck sent by his friend Robert Anstice. Being his first living specimen, he created a duckery by enclosing the pond on his land. Over the next 9 years until his death, he rehabilitated pochard, cormorant, crake, stork, pintail, swan and more. His letters to Anstice, who sent him most of these water birds, are charming to read. His collection of birds was bought by the British Museum, now in Tring. Montagu's favourite hunting ground was Salcombe Harbour. His interests included discovering new species of crustaceans and fish. Several species were named after him: here Montagu blenny, snapper and sea snail. He was also first to identify the lesser horseshoe bat, seen here in my shed. However, he specialised in mollusk shells and amassed a huge collection. He wrote Testacea Britannica, or Natural History of British Shells, in 1803, with a supplement in 1808. It described 470 species of land, freshwater and marine shells, and was again beautifully illustrated by Eliza Dorville. He used his own collection of shells for the descriptions and illustrations. He was sent shells by his friends, said to be found on the British coastline, so he included them in his book. It is now known that some of these do not occur here naturally. It is possible that his friends deliberately gave him foreign shells. It is also possible that some of these exotic shells came from ballast of wrecked sailing ships. Whilst most of the foreign shells were found dead, some were collected alive. Maybe the earliest record of alien and invasive species arriving in Britain. This gave the scientific community food for thought. Many of his specimens are very small. These photos were taken with a light and a scanning electron microscope. A new species has first to be published in a scientific journal or book. For example, in 1817, the Journal of the Linnaean Society published a paper by Montagu, where he described these shells as a new species, Alvania zetlandica. A particular specimen must be chosen to represent this new species, the type specimen. In Montagu's collection of 470 mollusks, there are 120 type specimens, including my favourite, the cowrie. Quite a feat. His shell collection is now at the Royal Albert Memorial and Art Museum and the Natural History Museum in London. In 2020, the Arts Council England recognised the international importance of his shell collection by awarding it designation status. It is the most intact and scientifically important collection of British shells of the early 19th century anywhere in the UK.
This quotation is a description of the location of Knowle House, made by Abraham Hawkins, a friend and contemporary of George Montagu, in 1818. Nearly at the north end of this parish, and on the knoll, highest summit of a hill called Knowle, overlooking House, commanding an extensive view of land and water to the south extremity of the navigable estuary, stands Knowle House, the property of Sir Edwin Bainton Sandys, Baronet of Missedon Castle in Gloucestershire. From the year 1799 to mid-1815, it was occupied by the late George Montagu. Hawkins goes on to say that the pleasure grounds surrounding the house were chiefly formed and resulted in taste and judgment uniting to embellish and adorn a charming residence on a minor scale. The inference from all of this is that Montagu only rented the house, but was able to develop the extensive grounds to his own designs. More of this later. George and his mistress, Elizabeth Dorville, set up house together in Kingsbridge, and this delightful drawing of the rather imposing house and sweeping drive up to it is an artist's impression of how Knowle House looked at that time. This view would have been seen from a somewhat smaller dwelling in which they also lived, known as Knowle Cottage, at the entrance to the drive through a curved stone gateway. All that remains today are the renamed cottage, the stone walls and a part of the drive. The illustration, produced in 1843, is by Reverend William Holdsworth, a vicar from Brixham, and was included in William Yarrell's History of British Birds. There has been considerable confusion over the whereabouts of this old house, and we've done some research to try to clarify things. This image shows a painting of the barracks in 1812, which many of you have seen before, but if you look at the top of the highest hill in the distance, you will see Knowle House, now in the centre of the painting. This lovely etching also shows the somewhat isolated house, with only the two upper floors visible above the trees on the outer edge of Kingsbridge, now seen in close-up. This map is really interesting, as it is an overlay of a much older map, circa 1885, in darker print on top of the modern, paler one of Kingsbridge, showing Knowle House on Stenterford Hill. In the centre of the map is Knowle House, labelled and outlined in red, alongside a group of buildings with several additional ones comprising stables and outhouses. Below the house the drive can clearly be seen, and at the very bottom, also labelled and outlined in red, is Knowle Cottage. Over to the right is marked the position of the lake or duckery that George created, and which still exists at the bottom of a garden next to the Dodd Brook. The house and garden are situated in Manor Park, the pale grey road that now sweeps down through the original pleasure grounds between the house and the duckery. This detail from the 1840 tithe map of Kingsbridge and Dodd Brook shows Knowle House, with the owner's name, Sir Edwin Sandys, below it. Near the bottom, and facing directly onto Fore Street, is clearly marked Knowle Cottage, and next to it the words Mrs. Dorville to indicate her ownership. We found this map, dated 1885, interesting as it depicts Knowle House outlined in red near the top with an almost enclosed group of buildings which are still standing as mews-type cottages around a courtyard, probably stabling and stable loft accommodation. Below that are the formal gardens alongside a walled kitchen garden with glass houses, aviaries and numerous pathways down the hillside through the pleasure grounds. Halfway down can be seen Mrs. Dorville's cottage. Leading from the cottage garden is a winding, but now straightened, footpath down to the little bridge over a tributary to the lake or duckery alongside the Dodd Brook. This path runs through all the carefully planted trees, which were possibly apple orchards and conifers. Below and to the right of it can be seen Prospect House, which has been mistaken for Knowle House. We know for certain from several census returns that it was occupied as a boarding house and later as a maternity home, but George Montagu never lived there. Another house, lower down Fore Street on the same side and outlined in green, was built in the early 19th century, named originally Lower Knowle. Much later the name was changed to the Knowle House. Unfortunately, this house has mistakenly been given a blue plaque indicating that George Montagu the naturalist lived there. The Town Council acknowledged the mistake, but because there is no identifiable house still standing, decided to leave the plaque there, as it is at least near the location of the original house. The house with the blue plaque is the Knoll House, as shown in Fore Street, just above Duncombe Street. However, Knoll Cottage remains practically unaltered, apart from its name, and fortunately the curved stone wall mentioned earlier is still standing as the entrance to a new small gym and the former St John's Ambulance Centre. The black and white photo in the top left shows Knoll Cottage, just below where the tollgate entrance was in Fore Street. Top right shows it as it is today, just before the police station, and renamed Manor Cottage, which happened after the 1881 census, when it was occupied by Samuel Merchant family. The other large photo below this is of Knoll Cottage, taken this year, and now bearing the name Manor Cottage. We were quite excited about our discovery, as everything else started to fall into place. In 1956, this plaque on the wall pictured on the bottom left was erected by the Devon Birdwatching and Preservation Society. These are the well-preserved stable mews cottages to Knoll House, alongside its walled garden as they look today. Looking from Dodbrook towards the back of the stable block cottages, we can see there are in fact two walled gardens still intact, circled in red. Manor Cottage, the new name for the cottage, links with the new name for the main house. Yes, Manor House, which we discovered by looking at all the census returns for the two residences from 1841, just before Elizabeth Dorville, who was never married to George Montagu, had died. As you would expect, many changes of ownership took place, but Knoll House was owned by successive generations of the Hurrell family from 1871 to 1911 and maybe 1921. However, we can see that John Hurrell, a county council solicitor, changed the name to Manor House at the same time as the cottage changed its name. We wanted to find out more about the house's fate. It seems the house was taken over, probably requisitioned, by the Rural District Council and run as a wartime hospital and mortuary. We have uncovered reports stamped 1944 from the Medical Officer of Health and the sanitary inspectors located at Manor House. This more modern map, certainly produced after the arrival of the railway in 1893, shows the former Knoll House, now renamed Manor House. Interestingly, it lies on the site of a former medieval manor house. Is this the reason for the name change by the Hurrell family? Nicola at the museum filled in the next piece of the jigsaw, as she recalled having seen an article in the Gazette about Manor House, which after the war was run as a council depot and was about to be demolished and replaced by a purpose-built structure in 1977. She located the newspaper article and the one and only photograph for us of Knoll/Manor House. This is undoubtedly the elusive house, the main part to the left clearly showing the 3 floors and the hipped roof. It had been extended to the right and an additional veranda had been added. Sadly, a council lorry can be seen as well as a skip in the foreground. It was demolished and replaced by a purpose-built council depot building by the new South Hams District Council. The new depot, which nobody wanted, was subsequently itself demolished and the land redeveloped for housing in 2006. If we now focus on the 3-storey principal part of the house before the addition of the 2 wings, we can see the resemblance to Knoll House in the earlier artist's impression of the late 18th century. However, I must apologise for the poor definition in this enlargement. We now move into the 21st century with two images from Google Earth. The first shows the newly built white South Hams District Council depot, outlined in red in the centre, with Knowle/Manor Cottage outlined in red at the bottom. You can't see the lake to the right clearly because of the trees, but it is still there. The second Google Earth image, produced in 2020 and this time in colour, shows outlined in red in the centre of the image the position of Manor House, now the new driveway into Montagu Close off Stenterford Hill. Just above this can be seen the stable/mews and the walled kitchen garden. A small attractive group of homes now sits in the grounds of the original house. These photographs are of Montagu's Duckery, or the lake, from 1988 to present day. We contacted the present owner of No. 4 Manor Park, in the garden of which the duckery, now a little overgrown with duckweed, see the photo at the bottom right, is still clearly evident. He kindly lent us these images to complete the story. The photograph of the gentleman dressed in 19th century costume was taken during filming of a short documentary section on George Montagu by BBC Spotlight in 2006.
It has been said of George Montagu that he was just an upright, simple-minded English country gentleman who loved natural history, but there was far more to him than that. George was born on June the 6th, 1753 at Lackham House near Laycock in Wiltshire, the third son of James and Elizabeth Montagu. The family, of extreme property wealth, also held an estate in Alderton, Wiltshire, which George was much later to inherit. James Montagu, the second but eldest surviving son of James and Elizabeth, never married. On the death of his father in 1790, James Montagu inherited Lackham House. Between 1791 and 1796, he had the ancient manor house at Lackham, which had been standing for 800 years, demolished and had built in its place a Georgian house with a classical form which, although much altered, is the present Lackham House. This building, which is depicted in the present day, now houses Wiltshire College. At the age of 17, he enlisted as an ensign in the army. Two years later, the youthful militiaman eloped to Gretna Green with the even more youthful Anne Courtney, his childhood sweetheart. Anne was the daughter of William Courtney and Lady Jane Stewart, another wealthy family of Wiltshire landowners. She was the granddaughter of the Earl of Bute, Prime Minister during the reign of George III. He was promoted to lieutenant in 1773 and embarked to America in 1775 at the start of the American War of Independence, by which time he had been promoted to captain. The regiment engaged in the action against Washington, forcing his retreat from Long Island. It saw action at the battles of Long Island, White Plains and Fort Washington in 1776. It also took part in the battles of Brandywine, Germantown and White Marsh in 1777. These were all early battles in the war, in which the British initially triumphed. At this time, whilst George was in the 15th Regiment of Foot, 4 members of the family were stationed in North America. His uncle, Admiral John Montagu, was commanding the British Navy in the colonies, and George's cousins, George and James, were captains serving under their father. It was whilst stationed in America that George first started his work as a naturalist, initially by shooting any of the more interesting American birds. Anne stayed at Lackham during this period of separation. George resigned his commission in 1777 and returned to England, bringing with him a collection of birds he had shot in America, including the American bittern and little egret, many of which we now see in Kingsbridge estuary today. From this period up to the 1780s, he resided with his wife in a number of country houses in Wiltshire, where Anne gave birth to 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. 3 of his sons were to die in active service. James was in the army and died while a prisoner of war in France in 1790. John was killed on active service with the Royal Navy. He was captain of and killed while commanding HMS Montagu during the French Revolutionary Wars in 1794. Frederick, George's favourite son, was killed in the Battle of Albuera in Spain against the French in 1811. But by the late 1780s he was starting to tire of family life. In a letter to a friend, Gilbert White, dated 29th of June 1789, he wrote, "I have delighted in being an ornithologist from infancy, and was I not bound by conjugal attachments, should like to ride my hobby to distant parts." George was in 1790 given a commission in the Wiltshire Regiment of His Majesty's Militia and moved around the country on different postings, being promoted to Lieutenant Colonel in 1791. This gave him ample opportunity to pursue his hobby. He kept his rank until 1799, when he was deprived of his insignias after he had been brought before a war tribunal, accused and found guilty of womankind affairs and some provocative marital skirmishing. Enter Mrs. Elizabeth Dorville. By this time he had already started a relationship with Mrs. Elizabeth Dorville, whom he had first met in London at the wedding between his sister Arabella and Ralph Dorville Woodford, a relative of Elizabeth's in London. It is thought that Mrs. Dorville accompanied George to his military postings, and it is very likely that George's association with Mrs. Dorville was also the major cause of his problems with the militia. In 1797, Elizabeth had separated from her husband, John Dorville, with whom she already had 3 children. She moved to Kingsbridge with her 6-year-old daughter Elizabeth, where it is reported she lived in Knoll Cottage. A year later, in 1798, she and her daughter had moved with George to live in Knoll House, where she bore him a child, Henry. George was at that time, and remained thereafter, still married to his wife Anne. The association with Mrs. Dorville, however, had desperate consequences for George and the Montagu estates. Although the Lackham estate, held in trust, was initially bequeathed to George by his brother James, he could not benefit from it. In a codicil to his will, James had stated, "My brother George shall not live at my mansion at Lackham unless he shall live and cohabit with his wife." The trust was to pass down the line of succession, and as James had no legitimate heirs, was to pass down in due course to George's eldest son, George Conway Montagu. 1800 was not a good year for George. He and his eldest surviving son, George Conway, fell out. George Conway brought a suit against the trustees for failing in their duties and colluding with his father, allowing his father to strip the assets of the estate. Whilst living in Kingsbridge in the early 19th century, he did not spend all his time on natural history, however. His military skills were soon again in demand. Napoleon's Grand Army, massing on the cliffs of Boulogne in 1803, waited only a fair wind to cross the Channel to invade England. The Royal Navy, too, waited. He wrote to Earl Fortescue, Lord Lieutenant and Vice Admiral of the coast of Devon, putting forward the suggestion that local men who frequently disregarded the game laws could be usefully deployed for their shooting skills to defend their country. He subsequently raised a regiment of yeomanry at Kingsbridge to repel invaders. George was in charge of the guides for Napoleonic defence. George produced his best-known works, the Ornithological Dictionary and Testacea Britannica, whilst living in Kingsbridge in the early 1800s with his friend in science, Elizabeth D'Orville. Both works were beautifully illustrated by Elizabeth, who shared his interest in natural history and was an amateur artist. He did not name the feminine hand of the engraver, and she remains still under-recognised for her contribution to his work. Less well known is that George had already published another volume in 1792 during his period with the Wiltshire Militia, the Sportsman's Directory or Tractate on Gunpowder. He had become proficient in the use of a gun from an early age, stalking after great bustards on Salisbury Plain, and this book deals with weapons, duelling and sport. It is therefore ironic that some 20 years after writing it, he accidentally shot and fatally wounded a friend who was on a visit to the family home at Lackham. His state of mind afterwards was reportedly indescribable. George died in 1815. I managed to access copies of his and Elizabeth's wills. Reading old wills is an interesting but challenging task, largely because they contain no paragraphs or punctuation. George's was particularly challenging since, not trusting in solicitors, it was written in his own hand in a rambling and repetitive style. He wrote, "And in order that this, my last will and testament, should be exempt from the ambiguity so common in the writings of lawyers, I have thought proper to publish it in my own handwriting, and have my intentions in as small a process as possible, and without possibility of being misconstrued." In his will, George Montagu provided for his wife Anne, who survived him by just 1 year, but also for Elizabeth D'Orville, to whom he left his most treasured belongings. As well as an income for Anne from properties held in trust, he made separate provision for his surviving daughters, but no provision for his estranged son, George Conway, who benefited from his interest in the estate trust inherited from his Uncle James. George wrote his first will in 1805, in which he also made provision for his son Frederick. But after the death of his favourite son, he wrote a codicil to his will in 1814. In addition to his landed property, Elizabeth D'Orville was left all of George's books and collections of natural history cabinets, all his manuscripts and publications with their copyright, and his coins, plate, jewels and household furniture. In her will, made in 1839, Elizabeth left all her personal effects and estates, which had been left by George, to their son, Henry D'Orville. This was to include all that dwelling house and tenement farmyard and orchard, and all premises situated at Knowle in the parish of Kingsbridge in the county of Devon, and also all that other house, together with the Flora garden, those of land, orchard and barn, situated at Knowle aforesaid. Her jointure, which I believe to be the settlement she received on her marriage to John D'Orville, she settled on her closest daughter by John, Elizabeth. In June 1815, while workmen were working at Knowle Cottage, George Montagu trod on a rusty nail and developed lockjaw. He died just a few days later on 20th of June 1815. Earlier searches had failed to find an entry on the registers of Kingsbridge Parish Church, and there was some thought that he might be buried in Dogbrook. But eventually the record was discovered that confirmed George's resting place as being Kingsbridge Parish Church. In 1897, an unsuspected crypt was found at Kingsbridge Parish Church containing 2 very badly damaged coffins and a plate attached to one of them with the inscription "George Montagu, Esquire, born 18th of June 1753. Elizabeth lived on until 1844. Her property is marked on the 1841 tithe map of Kingsbridge and Dogbrook. Henry D'Orville, George's son by Elizabeth D'Orville, later became a vicar and curator at Exeter Museum and died in 1874. This miniature painting of George Montagu in a locket was bequeathed by Henry to the Linnaean Society. George's estranged son by Anne, Captain George Conway, gambled away his inheritance and spent some part of his life dodging his creditors, seldom at Lackham. The estate was heavily mortgaged and other estates and lands were sold piecemeal during the first half of the 19th century. There were lawsuits and eventually the estate was held in chancery. George Montagu, at the end of a life well lived, left a lasting legacy of enlightened interest in the knowledge of natural history.